Go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I'm so excited to welcome back the amazing Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife to the podcast today. If you are familiar with her work, you already know how powerful and amazing her insights are. And if you don't know her, if this is your first introduction, you are in for a treat today, I promise. So, Dr. Finlayson-Fife is a renowned relationship and sexuality coach with a PhD in counseling psychology. She's the creator of transformative online courses on personal and sexual development and the host of The Room for Two. So that's a podcast that explores the complexities of intimacy and connection. So today we're diving into a topic that impacts so many of us. We're going to be talking about sexual shame. So whether it's from cultural, religious, or personal experiences, shame around our sexuality can profoundly affect our relationships, including those in mixed faith marriages. And I am confident that Dr. Finlayson-Fife will shed light on this sensitive subject with her amazing compassion and wisdom and give us some great tools to help us move forward and to heal. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for being here today and welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Anytime. So, I shared a little like of your professional stuff. What are some fun things just about you, like you as a person that we should know about?
Fun things. Let's see. I'm trying to think what would be something people just don't know, but I love decorating. It's like, it was the other thing I started when I was younger. I thought I wanted to be like a residential architect, and I wanted to be a therapist too, but I just didn't know if I could be smart enough to get a PhD. I think that felt really intimidating to me. And I somehow thought, I could get a degree and either be an architect or a designer, an interior designer, because I really liked that and I continue to love that. So I care about that a lot. It's just kind of my hobby and my free time. I don't actually get to spend as much time doing it as I want because I have this other big passion that matters to me. But it's a pleasure to, go find antiques. And I don't mean like really nice antiques. I mean just cool stuff in old shops that, has some character in it. And yeah, I like doing that.
I love that. Have you ever been to Brimfield in
Oh
Western
yeah.
Mass?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we used to live actually right out that way, way back, right after while I was working on my PhD. So, yeah.
Mm. That's a fun place to
Oh
go
yeah,
check
so
out.
fun.
Okay, what about like favorite baked good or
Oh
treat?
gosh, cookies, chocolate chip cookies. I really love a good cookie. And a good croissant, but it has to be a really good croissant for me to want it.
For it to
So
count. The
I've been
Costco ones
spoiled
don't cut
by
it.
a few French croissants, and so then it just changes your whole perspective on what a croissant is and ought to be. Yeah.
I love that.
Uh,
Okay. Any other little tidbits that you wanna,
oh gosh, let me just think.
maybe something that nobody knows about you? Just something like,
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think. That nobody knows. I mean, I'm just trying to think of anything that would be even slightly interesting that nobody knows. Uh,
and it's okay if not.
I'm just
Okay.
trying to think of something that would be interesting. Um, oh, well, this is a sad thing I've been thinking about lately, but I um I was just reflecting on the fact. I have no idea if this is something that's going to be interesting, but when I was about 4 years old, I let our little kitten out of the front door. And I kind of knew it was not the right thing to do, but I just had 4-year-old impulse control, and everybody was playing in the front yard. And so I let the kitten out, and the neighbor dog came over and attacked it. And I just remember as a child just feeling intense guilt about that. That took me so long to like kind of, but I can still actually feel it when I think about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, we were
Yeah.
just as a family, we were talking about some of the like the narrow misses, the things that like could have gone so wrong. And I was thinking about that and just how as an adult, you think back and you're like, well, of course, a 4-year-old just can't sort of fully process all that. But it's interesting, like when you are that child, how you can really take it on. And nobody actually was hard on me. My parents were not, I didn't get in trouble or anything actually, but I just, felt like I loved that kitty. And so it
Yeah.
was really hard actually. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I think too that, well, and this is probably the perfect segue, our talking about
Shame.
shame, our
Yeah.
nervous systems are constantly looking for safety and danger, and those
That's right.
imprints that have happened when we were 4 and
Yeah.
younger,
Yeah.
our nervous system started developing in utero. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely something that would
Yeah.
um, influence that. So, okay, so let's talk. I want to talk all about shame. So, can you give us a little shame one-on-one 101?
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah, how do you define it?
Sure. Well, I'm maybe a little different than some people in that I actually think shame is a positive thing. And what I mean by that is to be shameless is a very, very bad thing, right?
Hmm.
What I think we're usually talking about is when shame becomes toxic, when we turn it into because I am flawed, I am worthless, because I am a human being who does things wrong or makes bad choices sometimes. I'm unacceptable, right? I am disgusting. I am, abhorrent or something. And that's when we move into a kind of crippling shame that interferes with our ability to live and choose and love in the world. But we don't want to go to shameless either, because that impulse to kind of self inhibit and to consider the consequences and to say, is it I? Did I do something wrong? That's very, very important. In fact, you can't be in a good relationship if you don't have two people who are willing to self confront, to say, hey, do I play a part in this problem? So I know this is just a linguistic thing, but I actually think we are wired up to have shame in a way that matters. It's just when we go too far in either direction that it becomes a problem. Shameless people you can't be in relationship with because it's never them, it's always you. Right? You can't. They can be abusive and superior and unwilling to take responsibility. But it can also be fully dysfunctional to say, well, everything is my problem. If I would do something different, everybody else would be okay. And so if we take everything onto ourselves, even things that don't belong to us, we will struggle in relationships. It's also true, like, when it comes to sexuality. Well, I'll maybe back up a little bit from that. One of the challenging things is to um, figure out what is my responsibility, what is not my responsibility, and to learn how to forgive ourselves and to move forward better, to move forward wisely. That's like a developmental capacity that the better we learn it, the more able we are to be in intimate relationships. That is, that I can be flawed and still be knowable, that I can accept you as flawed and still love and choose you. And that requires us growing in our ability to love and accept and forgive ourselves and others. And so that's just a developmental skill. One of the things that human beings also have to learn how to accept if they're going to be in intimate relationships is the fact of our sexual nature, the fact that we are sexual, erotic beings. And I think for many of us, whether LDS or not, whether religious or not, that is the hardest thing to actually really integrate and come to peace with as a human being, because it's a very vulnerable part of being human. And so sometimes in our anxiety about the fact of pleasure and openness and letting somebody in on who we are, because it makes us anxious, we can go in one of two directions, go into that toxic shame, like I'm unworthy of pleasure and I'm not I'm not desirable and I'm unattractive. And we can just kind of move into this kind of rejection of our humanity and our sexual nature. Or we can go into a kind of entitled position, which some people who also have big sexual issues in a relationship are doing. They're more like, this is natural and you should be fine with this. And, and they're kind of in a demanding position because they also aren't at peace with themselves sexually. And they're
Mm,
trying to get someone else, their partner, to make their sexuality okay. And so learning to truly accept our sexuality is, in my view, still different than a sex positive position. I mean, I know that's the language we use a lot,
yeah.
or people who claim to be completely comfortable with sexuality, because I would say most human beings are not completely comfortable
Mhm.
with the vulnerability of sexuality and, in particular, sexual intimacy. So people may go out and do a lot of sexual things, but that's very different than being at peace with really being knowable sexually, or really letting somebody in on who you are. What I think religious people can do a lot is they project that onto God. That is, God also hates sexuality. God
Mm.
also um, doesn't want me to have pleasure because I'm anxious about this. And so we sometimes project onto God what are our anxieties about what it is to be human.
And I think we get a lot of times I notice myself not, in maybe different areas, but we feel shame and that feels
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And so we blame. We blame
Hmm.
God, we blame the church, we blame our partner, we blame,
Yeah.
it's kind of this, I think of it like a shame blame teeter-totter because
Yeah.
it doesn't,
Right. Because we're trying to manage exactly, the shame is the one down and the blame is going one up, and we're dysregulated and having a hard time integrating the fact of our humanity and our flawed nature and our sexual nature. And to be able to come to an honest peace is, in my view, what personal and spiritual development is. So, a lot of times we use the idea of spirituality to be more about this kind of shaming God and our compliance to that shaming God. But that's an early understanding of spirituality, because what I think of as real, developed spirituality is this ability to be in intimate communion with God, with a partner, with ourselves, with reality, that we can be able to experience the beauty and the awe and the wonder of it all. And it requires a kind of acceptance of ourselves and of what is, of reality and the goodness and the beauty that's there.
Oh, one thing that I was going to ask you about earlier, so kind of circling back a
Sure.
little bit. So often we hear about the difference between shame and guilt. And I thought that was interesting how you said that, well, we don't want to be shameless. We want to have
Yeah.
that. What is your take on that with
Yeah,
the
it's
difference
just
between
maybe
the two?
another language frame of the same idea, that some people have said, shame is the negative thing and guilt is positive. And I'm fine with that idea in a sense. I kind of prefer the idea of the continuum and kind of how we relate to this natural and important impulse. So yeah, but what I think other people might say is shame is when you're like, I've done something wrong, therefore I am worthless. That's shame. Versus, I've done something wrong and my conscience is kicking in. I need to do something about it or do something different. And that's guilt. So it's like pro social because it moves you forward. And it's the same idea. What I would say is
Okay.
toxic shame is crippling and healthy shame moves you forward. When you're like, I am sorry for what I did, or I need to make up for that, or I need to change something. That's a healthy shame, or I need to inhibit myself, you know. So it's the same idea, just different language.
Okay. I like that because it's I just thinking of, when I'm thinking about guilt, it's like, okay, this is out of character with who I want to be,
Yeah,
therefore I want to
exactly.
change. But
Against
I
your
like
integrity.
that because I think
Hmm.
shame, when we hear about shame, it can feel really scary. Like I shouldn't be feeling this. That's,
Yeah,
I've even heard people say that how I can't, that, shame is from Satan or whatever. And
yeah,
it's like,
yeah. Right, right, exactly.
so
And
yeah.
yeah, anytime we turn it into because I'm flawed, I'm worthless, I think it's a rejection It's an understandable one. I mean, I think every healthy person out there has done this at some point. Every person who knows something about shame has done this at some point, which is you turn the fact of your mistakes into your worthlessness, into a
Yeah.
crippling anxiety. But I think as we grow, we get more able to have compassion towards ourselves and say, you know, as sad as that was, a 4-year-old probably just couldn't do any differently. Right. Of course, I still had a moment yesterday where I went, you know, so we can still do it. We can still fall into our like, oh, but mostly I feel compassion for my younger self that I took it
Yeah.
on so entirely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I like thinking of it on the spectrum that it's okay to notice that you're feeling shame, that shame can
Hmm.
propel us forward.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so how do our cultural or religious teachings contribute to sexual shame?
Well, they can. So I'm working on a book and I'm really taking this on, which is how are ways that we can relate to our theology in ways that really actually inhibit our capacity for intimacy and joy and the integration of our sexuality versus what are ways that we can relate to our theology that actually help us move more deeply into the possibility of intimate connection with others, with a spouse, with ourselves. Like, that we can be at peace with ourselves. When I say intimate connection with ourselves, that we're able to be at peace in our own skin, that we can know our own hearts and minds, flaws and all, and have a basic ease within ourselves. That doesn't mean because I'm so perfect and I never make mistakes, but I can accept myself and I can accept a partner and feel his or her acceptance of me. The We can relate to our faith in a way that actually helps us get there, or we can relate to it in ways that continue that inhibit that process. So one of the ways I actually take it up in the book is I talk about it in terms of stages of our growth that are normal and important. But sometimes we get stuck in earlier stages. Just to give an example of this, like when I was younger, I thought of God in terms of like punishing or rewarding. And I remember learning about God, and we had a picture of Jesus on the wall. And I remember thinking of God in that way, but which is very, very normal. Like a young person can't really think outside of that sort of rule enforcer, that's either going to punish or reward.
Yeah.
And but because I don't know all the reasons, but because I had parents that were not punishing, that they had rules and there was structure, but they weren't shaming, they weren't harsh. It was a relatively safe environment. I was able to kind of grow from that sort of outside force that's either going to punish you or reward you to more of a conception of God as one that cared about the rules, cared that you learned the rules and internalized the rules, but that there was a predictability to it all. The reason I'm telling all this is because I remember being in high school and I was a pretty compliant kid and I didn't disobey the rules. I wasn't particularly rebellious because in my family there wasn't a lot to rebel against. Actually, my parents were pretty laissez-faire in a lot of ways. And but my friend who had very critical parents, very, how to say it, like what's the word, like unpredictable. They would just
Mm,
come down with these really harsh punishments out of the blue. You never really knew where you stood with them, and I knew the parents pretty well because I would go over to their house. She was much more rebellious in high school. She was doing, she was drinking and doing things like that. And I remember her walking next to me once late at night, and she said, "I'm really glad to be walking next to you." And I was like, "Why?" she's like, "Because God will protect us because of you." you know. And at the time, I chuckled. I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, you think that God's gonna let somebody come and rob us or whatever?" How to say it? I'm not saying this well. that basically God would let it happen to you, but God won't let it happen to me just
Mm-hmm.
because I don't drink. Like I thought that was a funny thing to me. I was just kind of chuckling with her about that, but she really did believe it that way. And the reason I think that is because she grew up in a world of kind of the experience of a parent as very random and vindictive and unpredictable and punishing if you did anything wrong. And their parents could be like, you did the smallest thing wrong and you get like the wrath of both parents. So my point, this is a long way of getting to this,
No
is just to
worries.
say, she internalized a God that was very shaming, very rejecting, quite hostile. And if you did anything wrong, you were going to pay for it. Well, anybody in that understanding of God, and of course, she came by this 100% honestly, because
Mm-hmm.
this was her experience of authority.
Yeah.
And so you either are trying to kind of escape it and get your freedom on your own, but she would still then feel kind of crushing guilt about that too. It's not like it made her feel bad about herself, a lot of the things that she was choosing. But she was also looking for an understandable kind of freedom in a very tyrannical home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so of course she saw God that way. And so somebody in that environment is going to often see God as very shaming of you shouldn't have pleasure. I say that life is about joy, but I don't really mean it. And you're going to be punished if you are enjoying good things in your life, or that on some level that means you're being reckless and that something bad might happen to you. You just see a much more punitive and unpredictable God. Where if you grow up in an environment where you're loved and you're accepted and there's some predictability, and yes, there are consequences, but you may hear the same lessons at church, but hear them in a frame of, yeah, but God wants me to be happy. And sexuality is a good thing. And how am I going to, I want to relate to it in a smart way and not be reckless with it or undermine a marriage or undermine myself. So these rules are here to protect me, but they aren't about sexuality being a bad thing. And so a lot of times we have, and in the book I take up and I challenge the ways that sometimes as teachers, well-intentioned, can promote shaming ideas, can
Mm-hmm.
promote the idea, false ideas, ideas that aren't even consistent with our theology about how being sexual will undermine your value or your worth, right? Or that that pleasure is antithetical to the spiritual, which I think is entirely wrong. So we can definitely teach these things, but it's also true how we have lived our lives and what we've experienced will shape the way we internalize those messages and what they mean to us. Um, I remember hearing lessons from teachers and thinking, I don't accept the way that they're talking about that. It felt wrong to me. But
Yeah.
that's also because I think I had an internal sense that I felt was clearer headed or clearer way to think about God and sexuality. And so I wasn't as vulnerable to some of those messages, I think.
Yeah. I think in so specific, oh, and this is my next question.
Yeah.
How does sexual shame affect mixed faith marriages and relationships? And I think that's one of the important
Yeah.
things to recognize. So I grew up in it sounds like we had similar upbringings. My
Yeah.
parents were wonderful and very open. And, I pitch my dad's the greatest person ever. I picture Heavenly Father being like
Like,
my dad and
yeah.
and that's a good, a beautiful
Sure.
thing.
Definitely.
And just because my experience growing up in the church could look very, very different than someone else with
Right.
the
Right.
things that they've experienced. So I think that's a really important thing
Yes.
to understand. So
Yes.
let's go into that question. How does sexual shame affect mixed faith marriages and relationships? And maybe like what are some of the common
Yeah,
ways it
it's a
might show
really
up?
tricky question. It's a really broad question. So that is to say, it's very hard for me to answer succinctly because sometimes the false idea is that and it can be true sometimes, of course, but sometimes the idea is someone who stays religious is going to have more shame than somebody who is no longer religious. And that could be true, right? Especially if you have a God that's very punitive in a religious frame, and then you let go of that idea in a non-religious frame. But the goal, how to say it? I'm trying to be succinct here. I've seen people that either stay in the church or leave the church, and they really just stay reasonable, and they've internalized a morality that is responsible and loving and integrated. And so even if one stays in the church and their partner leaves, they're basically operating from a collaborative position about how to create a good relationship, a good marriage, a good sexual relationship. Where it gets trickier is if someone is staying in the church and they feel like um, they have a notion of God as demanding, that there are rules that must be followed, that sexuality is antithetical to spirituality. I was working with someone recently and she was like, my husband says things are too vanilla, but I want to be a worthy person and I don't want to do the things. And he wasn't asking for anything crazy. I mean, he not at all. In fact, he's just
Yeah.
saying like we're so controlled and it's so routine. But she immediately took it into that would make me unworthy of going to the temple and unworthy. I just
Mm,
don't want that. I don't want anything other than every Thursday we do the same thing and that will feel controlled and that makes me a good wife and I'm doing my role. So she, really wanted this kind of idea of safety and control around sex.
mm-hmm.
And if you're in a religious orientation like that, it could be very hard on a spouse that's doesn't see the world, whether they're in the church or not. This can be
Yeah.
hard because
Yeah.
it's like there's so much control and anxiety around it that there's no room for a really honest, intimate connection. It's just too controlled and constricted. And so it doesn't feel free. But I have also seen people who leave and take it as like, okay, like now I don't have to obey any rules. I have been controlled all this time and shamed all this time, and now I'm going for shameless. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm going into this other realm in which it's actually undermining the security or the foundation of the marriage. It's more rebellious. It's like a prolonged adolescence. It's kind of in that frame and which will only make the more devout person kind of get more entrenched probably in
Yeah.
their I mean, maybe they'll be like, okay, I'll do something to make you happy, but then I'm going back to this sense of safety
Yeah. It
because
doesn't
you
feel safe to
represent
them.
non-safety. And then the person that's out is like, oh my gosh, you're so rigid that and that can make it easy for them to want to be more, you know, free of rules, free of constraints. And when our morality is really externalized, which it starts that way for all of us, it
Mm-hmm.
has to start that way. We have to depend on parents and religious leaders and society to tell us what the rules are. But if we're maturing and we're growing into a more developed person, we are internalizing those rules. We are internalizing those principles. We're integrating them. We're integrating our humanity, we're integrating our sexuality, and we're learning how to live in the spirit of the law, not in this kind of fear based letter of the law. But in some ways, at that point, it matters much less whether or not you're sitting in a pew every week. I'm not trying to dismiss attendance or anything like that, but you've internalized principles that are in your core. And so you're not going to betray a spouse, no matter the differences in your religious beliefs. You're not going to work against the safety of the partnership. You're not going to, you may now be more open to possibilities that someone who's referencing authority a lot is not going to be as open to. But if you're prioritizing the partnership, then you're continuing to figure out the question of what does it mean to love here? What does it mean to do right by this marriage? What does it mean to do right by our sexual friendship? And so that's my long answer to your simple question. But anyway,
I
yeah.
think that's a great, answer. I think too, so often we want checklists like this is acceptable, this isn't acceptable. And I think for me, just one of my favorite questions is, does this bring the two of us closer together? Is
Right.
this building our intimate
That's right.
relationship? Can we be
Right.
open and following what feels right and is bringing
Right.
goodness? And because
That's right.
anything good is of God, and that may, like
That's right.
we have to answer that question
That's right.
for
And in the
ourselves.
sexual realm, I mean, in defense of people who are like, how could sex be good? Because it's an understandable thing because the erotic mind is weird, and it likes often things that you would never want in the light of day. So a lot of times what turns us on or seems sexually appealing can be strange. It's like breaking rules and I mean like in our erotic mind
Hmm.
but that's when it's especially important to C.S. Lewis even talks about this. Like you have to have a good sense of humor. He's like, the thing that will kill sexual desire more than anything is these are the sacred rules of sexual intercourse or whatever. It is if we try to weigh it down too much. And of
Hmm.
course, C.S. Lewis says this, as do many other wise people, that of course sexuality needs a moral anchor. Of course, it needs a sense of loyalty and fidelity to really thrive. But within that frame, it also needs um, fun and playfulness and
Hmm.
the ability to pretend with the rules. Yeah, I mean, what I mean is kind of break the rules in a fun way. So what I mean by that is like, for example, children will often play like was be cops and robbers. And so the child will take on being the robber. That doesn't mean that they actually want to grow up and be a robber. They're playing out these sort of dynamic tensions that are a part of play. And sexuality can be that also. But if you are very scrupulous and or you take yourself very seriously or you assume that God does also, right? God
Hmm.
would not want me to pretend to be a robber because that's me, thinking the wrong thoughts or whatever. That then there's no room to accept our humanity and to actually even integrate it and to make peace with it. Right. Because even a child playing with being a robber, in a sense, is trying on what is that like? What is that human experience to be someone who's a bad guy? And the more we can integrate and understand it, the more it doesn't control us. We can control ourselves within our human impulses.
And will you define what you mean, scrupulous, scrupulosity? These are terms that we
Yeah.
hear
Well, just someone
sometimes.
who can favor the toxic shame. So, what I mean by that is there are people that are just higher in anxiety. And I think when we're kind of wired up to be more anxious, we can really fear or feel a sense that the world may be out of control. I think often very sensitive souls feel all the feelings of living in a world that is flawed, imperfect, and unpredictable. And so when someone has higher anxiety, they are often more prone to looking for forms of control that may not actually be real, but they're trying to find a sense of control. Obey the commandments, then I'll get the blessings I need for everything to go my way. And, or, make sure I do everything right, or else there can be the darker version of it. A punishing God will hurt me, or bad things will happen to me. So either whether from a sense of I need more control or God will punish me if I don't, in either frame, one can be very rigidly trying to get all the rules right, but in a way that kind of stays locked into an earlier stage rather than what's the actual spirit of this principle? What's the larger goal? What does it mean to live in the spirit of that idea? And, as we grow and get wiser, we get better at sorting that out and getting able to truly be clear about the spirit of the law. But if we have tremendous anxiety, it can be hard to let go of that letter of the law, scrupulosity.
Okay. Uh, let's see. I'm just looking at my other questions that I was thinking about. Um, Are there specific exercises or practices that individuals can try to confront and reduce sexual shame in their own lives?
Well, it depends again a lot on what the source is and kind of how so first of all, I would just make a distinction between, I think, myself as a sexual being and sex itself as a negative thing versus there are issues going on in my marriage that make me not want to be sexual, which is a different thing. And both can be true. But just for the sake of this question, I'm focusing on if I'm having a hard time accepting myself as an embodied sexual being capable of pleasure, what is it that is my work around this? And I think that, from an LDS theology point of view, we are, um, our theology is rather special in that it is very overtly embracing of embodiment as necessary for our spiritual progression. So some Christian interpretations see the body as a threat to spirituality, that it's a necessary evil, perhaps, but an evil it is. And that it's how Satan gets us is through the temptations of the body. Now, of course, it's true if we're just run around by our impulses, if we never learn how to integrate the body and inhabit the body, okay, well, then it can undermine our life and it can undermine our progression, of course. But and from our theological perspective, learning how to be embodied and to be an actor within a body capable of pleasure, sensuality, acting, doing, and knowing through the body, right? That it is a genuine gift for us. And I think it's like, can I engage faith in the idea that God actually wants me to have joy in my life? Not reckless, indulgent pleasure, because that will work against me, but a God who actually wants me to have joy, who actually wants me to be well. And if I didn't have that with my parents, believing in a being who is more developed than your parents, right? That actually does want something that you maybe haven't ever experienced from a parent. That just is a kind of faith. You're reaching for something that you don't yet know, but leaning towards that, having faith in it until you know it from your own experience helps you develop into a new possibility. Like we say we are that we might have joy, but many of us don't believe it. Like we're like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, maybe in the next life, it,
Yeah. Maybe for them.
yeah, exactly. For everybody else, but not for me. Life's about suffering, and it can be about a suffering
Yeah.
too. It can definitely be that. But that joy is actually a valuable thing. It's a way we replenish our souls. It's a way to feel the transcendence and the beauty in a world that can be dark and challenging as well. So believing that I don't mean just pleasure for its own sake, but that pleasure, a kind of being loving and being known through the body can be such a rich and sustaining form of pleasure, but just spiritual pleasure as well, like an emotional pleasure that really is about anchoring our souls, helping us move outside of ourselves. One of the things I write about in the book is that um, eros, which is one of the Greek forms of love is eros. And we think of it as sexual love, which it is, but it's a much broader concept than that. Eros is so much about um, the desire to transcend the self. That is to kind of move beyond the self, to commune with another soul, to commune with God, to commune with what we don't yet know. That's Eros. And when we're in our kind of constricted selves, in this more Thanatos energy, we're in the ego, we're in that sense of safety, we're in a sense of fear, and we're wanting control. But when we have spiritual or transcendent experiences, it's when we actually move outside of the ego and into a kind of communion with God, with another, with reality, right? We are still ourselves. We don't lose ourselves in that, but we expand our sense of who we are and we feel a deeper connection with the world around us. And so when people talk about spiritual experiences, they're often using that language about that. You know, that you feel this sense of oneness, you feel this sense of transcendence and awe. Good sex is that. It's not about just getting through the act of sex. It's not just about orgasm. It's about this ability to feel a sense of knowing and being known, of a sense of being fully yourself, and also being outside of yourself in a way through the experience of intimate sex. And so there is a parallel between the spiritual and the sexual, or there can be, right? Depending on how
Yeah.
we relate to both. So, um, so I'm not giving you an exercise. I'm not good at exercises. There's,
That's okay. I think what you shared was beautiful. I think what
yeah,
was when you were speaking, my thought was that our heavenly parents created these amazing bodies
yes,
that we have that are in their image, and it wasn't by accident. This is a
yes,
divine design that our bodies are equipped to feel pleasure and to connect and to,
yes,
it wasn't, this isn't something that is dirty or that God doesn't know about. Of course, He knows about
right,
it.
right.
Yeah,
I sometimes say like the body is good except for the bad parts. Like a lot of us kind of think that, that rather than no, the body is good,
it's
all
good.
of it, every part, every bit. And that takes some courage, but we are better. We're more at peace. We're more able to love others in their humanity when we can accept ours.
And that kind of leads me to the last question I want to talk about is so how can we teach our children this? So, especially in a mixed faith marriage, have different viewpoints. How can we create a shame-free, sex-positive approach while still having those individual
Principles.
beliefs and
Yeah, yeah.
principles? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I in the book I devote a chapter to that question. I also have a course on how to talk to your kids about sex that's answering exactly that question because the goal is sexual integration, and a lot of times we confuse sexual shame. Well, how is it? We confuse the idea of inhibition with doing our job as parents rather than sexual integration. Like, how do I help my child accept the fact of their embodied sexual nature, understand it as a gift, but also that learning how to make wise choices around this gift is a process, but a very, very important one. Because the more they learn to be smart with their sexuality, the more joy they can experience through it, right? You can't create a meaningful, intimate relationship if you haven't learned to be trustworthy around your sexuality. And you can't be trustworthy unless you are the agent of it. Sometimes what we do is we say, okay, no rules because that's all shaming. That's what I'm not saying Latter-day Saints do that, but some people are like, kind of like as long as it's consensual, it's good. That's the only rule. And it's kind of a simple idea that any inhibition would be a negative thing, which is a very naive idea, in my opinion. And then the opposite of that is like you must control and manage everything because otherwise it's bad and it's sinful. And that also interferes with the ability, because in a good sexual committed relationship, you need both brakes and gas. You need the ability to know how to be in connection with your sexual self, and you know how to inhibit when it's appropriate to inhibit yourself. And that's what intimate relationships require sexually, but also emotionally. You can't be in a loving, open hearted relationship if you don't know how to stop yourself when you're angry, if you don't know how to inhibit all of your impulses. That's what it requires. So the goal with our children is we're talking honestly about the gift of our embodiment, the gift of our emotions, the gift of our sexuality. And part of growing up is learning how to navigate those impulses and be the one in the driver's seat, not the one being driven around by them.
Hmm.
And that's a process that takes time. That doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. But if you don't get in the driver's seat, then being run around by your impulses is a really hard way to live and it limits what kind of relationships you can have. So that's the overarching frame of how we ought to talk to ourselves and our kids about what it is to be embodied and what our goal is. And sometimes we either lean way too much in the control or way too much in the pull up all the controls. And both of those are wrong. Both of those are off.
I like thinking about it that way, just having that and letting them know this is a good thing.
Yeah,
This is part of being a child of God to have
that's right.
these feelings and that this
Yeah,
is normal and healthy.
that's right. So many
Uh,
times, like kids are adolescents and they're starting to have all these sexual feelings, and they're kind of getting the message that this is like Satan, kind
yeah,
of
that it's
working on them.
bad.
It's bad. And it's like, no, it would be weird if you weren't having sexual feelings,
Yes.
right? Sexual feelings are just part of moving into pre-adulthood.
Yeah.
And it's a little unnerving and a little uncomfortable. And you're trying to figure out how to make sense of all these feelings. I mean, not an easy thing to be 13, of course, but giving them a sense of normalcy around it and what the goal is, like what
Yeah.
they're learning how to do because they want to be capable someday of an intimate, loving, passionate relationship.
And congratulations, your body works the way that your heavenly parents
Yeah,
designed it to work.
exactly.
And here are
Right.
some things to help you
Exactly.
to figure that out.
That's right.
Okay, is there anything else as we're wrapping things up? Is there anything else, any other little nuggets that you want to share with us?
Well, I think just only that, not to be too hard on ourselves that this isn't easy. Like, it's not easy to know how to integrate our passions in a way that accrue to our happiness. It's very easy to either repress them or indulge them, whether that's around food or, you know, validation or sex. It's easy to be off balance because it feels good to indulge our impulses, but it also can scare us, our impulses. And so the fact that we can vacillate rather than integrate is understandable. And the more we are hateful towards ourselves for that, probably the harder we make it. The more we can exercise some compassion in that process and believe in parents in heaven that love us through that process, as imperfect as we are in it, the better we're going to do with it.
I love that. Yeah. Loving our they we were given these amazing bodies for a reason. And I was thinking about this the other day. Our heavenly parents could have created us perfectly, but they
Yeah. Why
didn't. They
didn't
want
they?
us to learn. They want us to
Yeah,
grow from our experiences and to
exactly.
use the atonement and all those things
Yeah.
together. So,
That it's the whole point.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I just thank you so much for being here today and for answering these questions. How can people find you? And also, how can we find your book when it comes out?
Yeah. So people can find me on my website, which is my last name, Finlayson-Fife.com. And there will be like a pre-order link on there very soon um, for the book. And it will be on Amazon very soon. But, it's in the wrapping up stages of going to publication. So anyway, we're getting there.
Awesome.
Even saying that gets me like, oh, like I still have work to do and so many other things going on at the same time. But yeah, but it's very close. So
Well,
mhm.
I can't wait to read it, and I will include those links in the show notes. But thank you
Yeah,
so much,
thank
and
you.
I really appreciate you being here. And have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye bye.